The chartered transport dropped through Venus's upper cloud bank, and the hull made sounds I'd never heard metal make. A sustained groan that rose and fell with the density of the haze, broken by sharp pops where acid condensation found the seams between plates. I watched the viewport. Yellow-brown murk pressed against the glass, thick enough to look solid. Every few seconds something caustic streaked diagonally across the surface and left a fading scar. "Suit up if you haven't," the pilot said from the forward compartment. "We break the lower ceiling in 4 minutes, and I'm not stopping if you're not sealed." I pulled the borrowed environment suit over my shoulders and worked the seals. Venusian manufacture, heavier than anything we used on Mars, with reinforced joints and a collar lining designed to protect against atmospheric bleed. My family's intermediary had arranged it along with the transport, the formal wardrobe, and the introductory correspondence. All of it charged against the Palliser account, which meant I was carrying the debt before I ever set foot on the estate. The Aldgate family had sold water rights on Mars for 3 generations. When the aquifer beneath our northern claim turned saline 11 years ago, the name became what a minor colonial title becomes when the revenue dries up, a credential without backing. My mother spent 7 years negotiating small alliances, mineral leases, equipment contracts, a failed bid for a desalination franchise, and each one cost more than it earned. The Palliser marriage offer arrived through a brokerage firm on Ceres 6 months ago. A Venus cloud estate family, old wealth, colonial-era aristocracy, seeking an unmodified male of proven lineage for a formal union with the patriarch's daughter. The settlement would clear the Aldgate debts, restore our water claim registration, and establish a permanent income drawn from the Palliser estate's holdings. I'd studied the terms 4 times. I'd had our family solicitor review them. Everything appeared aggressive but legitimate, the kind of arrangement old money families use to absorb smaller houses when they need new blood, and the smaller house needs everything else. I was 29, healthy, college-educated, and the last male Aldgate with a clean genetic record. I was also the product being sold. I understood that. I'd made peace with it the way you make peace with any trade where your leverage is your body and your debts are your motivation. Carefully, with the paperwork reviewed, and without expecting the other side to care whether you enjoy the arrangement. The transport broke through the lower cloud ceiling, and Venus opened beneath us. I'd seen images of the Palliser estate. They hadn't prepared me. The mansion hung below 3 enormous suspension balloons, each a black ovoid 60 meters across, tethered to the main structure by cable arrays as thick as bridge supports. The cables were coated in something that might once have been white insulation and had become patchy yellow-green, eaten through in places to expose raw braided wire. Beneath the balloons stood the house itself, a 3-story stone and glass structure that should never have existed at this altitude. Marble facades gone green with chemical scarring, balconies with carved railings softened by acid exposure, glass domes, conservatories or observation rooms, clouded to near opacity and patched with industrial sealant where panes had failed. Gantries and maintenance catwalks trailed from the underside like exposed ribs, and below those, nothing. Hundreds of meters of open yellow-brown cloud, all the way down to a surface no human had ever walked on. The pilot brought us into a landing bay set into the mansion's eastern face. The bay doors ground open on corroded tracks. Inside, amber lighting flickered unevenly, powered by a generator I could hear laboring somewhere in the walls. The pilot kept the engines running. 30 minutes for unloading, he said. I'm fueled for the return burn, and I'm spending 0 nights here. The bay had the look of a place that received visitors and resented them. Scuffed decking, a single cargo pallet, chemical wash stations along both walls, a pressurized interior door fitted with locks that belonged on a vault. 3 servants met me inside the pressurization vestibule. They wore dark formal livery, coats, gloves, polished shoes, and heavy brass masks that covered their faces from the bridge of the nose to the chin. Each mask had twin filter cartridges socketed into the cheeks and a fine mesh grill over the mouth. The masks clicked, a small, precise, regular sound, like a clock mechanism cycling inside each one. All 3 masks clicked in the same rhythm. They took my bags without speaking and guided me through corridors that told 2 histories at once. The original architecture was grand. Carved stone archways, wood panelling imported from Earth, crown moulding and brass fixtures from an era when Venus cloud estates were built to prove wealth could make beauty survive anywhere. Overlaid on all of it, like surgery on a patient, ran sealed conduit pipes, junction boxes bolted through panelling, replacement wall sections of industrial aluminum where stone had cracked and been patched. The house was gorgeous and gutted, every beautiful surface cut open to accommodate the systems keeping it in the air. Edmund Palliser received me in a glass conservatory at the mansion's western end. The room was full of earth plants, oak saplings, ferns, clusters of something that might have been hydrangea, all of them dead in every way that mattered, maintained in an appalling imitation of life. Transparent tubing ran from a central pump into each plant's root system, trunk and major branches, feeding nutrient fluid through tissue that had stopped metabolizing years ago. The leaves were green because chlorophyll solution filled them. The flowers held their shape because polymer had been injected into the petals. The room was a garden of embalmed things pretending to grow. Edmund sat in a high-backed chair with armrests fitted with brass controls. When he reached forward to take my hand, the chair assisted his movement with a quiet, grinding effort. He was tall, gaunt, and wrapped in a gold-stitched robe that covered him from throat to floor. His face was largely original, lined, sharp-boned, with deep-set grey eyes that tracked me with real intelligence. His handshake was strong enough, but the timing was wrong. A delay separated the decision to grip from the grip itself, as though the signal had to pass through a relay before reaching his fingers. His skin had the waxy, over-moisturized quality of tissue maintained past its natural term. Mr. Aldgate. His voice was warm, educated, carefully controlled. You look remarkably like your grandfather's portrait, the same jawline. I hope the descent wasn't too difficult. The pilot seemed eager to leave. Edmund smiled. They always are. Venus is an acquired taste, and the acquisition period is longer than most pilots' patience. Please, sit. He was a good conversationalist. Over tea, served by a masked attendant whose filter cartridges clicked in that same synchronized interval, Edmund asked about my family, my education, Mars, the journey. He knew Martian colonial history well enough to reference specific land grant legislation that affected the Aldgate holdings. His questions about my health had the directness of a physician's intake interview disguised as social interest. Diet, exercise, surgeries, implants, genetic modification. I answered honestly. On that front, I had nothing to hide. My body was entirely unmodified. On Mars, where the old land grant families had resisted augmentation for generations as a point of genealogical pride, that was my primary credential. I look forward to meeting your daughter, I said when the interview had gone on long enough to make her absence strange. Edmund set down his cup. In due course, he said. The household prefers to observe formal sequence. Attachments made too early can interfere with judgment. He smiled again, and the conversation returned to Mars. Dinner that evening was formal, served in a hall whose windows looked out onto the cloud layer through acid-scarred glass. The table was long enough for 20 but set for 2, and the masked servants moved around us, their brass filters clicking together as they placed each course. The food was rich and well prepared, imported proteins, cultivated vegetables, wine from an orbital vineyard Edmund named with proprietary pride. The conversation continued easily. Edmund spoke about the estate's history, the early years of Venus colonization, the engineering challenges of maintaining a cloud-suspended structure through decades of acid exposure. He was proud of the house. He spoke about it the way a man speaks about his own body. Midway through the third course, a structural tremor rolled through the mansion. The table settings rattled. Wine shifted in the glasses. The servants paused in perfect synchronization, every mask tilting the same direction at the same instant, then resumed. Edmund braced against the table's edge, and the motion pulled his robe open at the chest. I saw it for approximately 2 seconds before he gathered the fabric closed. A hinged panel in his torso hung ajar. Inside, golden gears the size of coins meshed and turned in staggered intervals. Translucent tubing carried dark fluid through junctions between gear housings. Strips of grey-pink tissue, real, wet, alive, threaded between the golden components, rising and falling with a rhythm that almost matched breathing. The cavity had manufactured edges, magnetic clasps, a framework designed to be opened and closed for regular access. This was his body's architecture. The robe was a costume draped over a chassis. Edmund refastened the fabric. "Forgive the indelicacy," he said. "Atmospheric pressure variations play havoc with the cable tension. We adjust." The servants had kept working. The masks held their tempo, undisturbed. I listened and matched the interval against the rise and fall of Edmund's chest beneath the gold-stitched fabric. After dinner, a servant guided me to my quarters, a well-furnished room with sealed windows and a heavy door that locked from the inside. On the writing desk, beside the formal wardrobe my family's intermediary had arranged, sat the marriage contract in a leather binder. My personal terminal had lost satellite contact in the lower cloud layer and found only the estate's internal exchange, a closed system routed through Palliser infrastructure. I tried 3 times to force a transmission to the orbital relay. Each attempt returned the same polite failure notice. External communication unavailable. Local authority required. I opened the binder. The version I'd reviewed on Mars had been 41 pages. This copy was 63. I woke to the ticking of the atmospheric system in my room's ceiling, the same interval as the servants' masks, the same interval as Edmund's chest. Morning in the Palliser estate arrived as a change in the light's colour through the sealed windows, the yellow-brown cloud layer brightening by degrees until the glass domes glowed with sour, diffuse warmth. I dressed and went looking for the parts of the house I hadn't been shown. The corridors confirmed what I'd seen the night before. Original stonework and imported hardwood gave way everywhere to industrial intervention. I passed through a gallery hung with family portraits, Palliser men from the estate's first century, all painted in the grand colonial style, their bodies unmarked and fully biological, and the gallery opened onto a service corridor where the walls were bare conduit and sealed pipe runs. Every fine room fed into a functional one. The mansion's elegance survived as a skin around the engineering that held it aloft. I found the library by accident and Hargreaves by appointment. He was waiting behind a desk covered with contract documents, a thin man in his 50s with careful hands and a face organized by decades of legal work into permanent professional neutrality. He wore no mask. His breathing was his own. "Mr. Aldgate, I trust you slept well. Mr. Palliser has asked me to walk you through the full documentation this morning." "The full documentation is 22 pages longer than the version I reviewed on Mars." Hargreaves nodded as though I'd reported the weather. "Jurisdictional supplements. Venus colonial law requires additional provisions outside Martian contract frameworks. Nothing substantive has been altered in the core agreement." He walked me through the pages. Most of the additions were, as he claimed, jurisdictional. Residency requirements, atmospheric liability waivers, estate maintenance obligations, inheritance protocols specific to Venus cloud property law, communication routing permissions, and a waiver acknowledging that external transmission from lower cloud private estates depended on household relay systems. I read each one carefully. Hargreaves was patient. He annotated each clause. On page 54, I found the biological continuity clause. The language was dense, layered with cross-references to Venus colonial inheritance statutes I'd never encountered. Hargreaves explained it. Upon formal marriage into the Palliser household, My unmodified biological material would be reclassified as a household asset under Section 12 of the Venus Atmospheric Settlements Preservation Act. The clause defined biological material broadly: tissue, organs, skeletal structure, neural architecture, genetic material, and the phrase that stopped me: the complete and integrated biological system of the contributing party. My body. The whole thing. Classified as inheritable estate property, available for the preservation of the household's biological and institutional continuity. This is a property claim on my body, I said. It's a preservation provision, Hargreaves said. Colonial-era legislation designed to ensure aristocratic households maintained biological continuity across generations. The original intent was genetic, reproductive material, tissue banking for medical purposes. The Palliser household has updated the language to reflect current estate management practices. What current practices? Hargreaves closed the binder. Mr. Palliser can speak to the household's medical programs in greater detail. I'm legal counsel. My role is to ensure you understand the contractual framework. A later appendix referred to secondary manual governance of atmospheric, thermal, and buoyancy systems in the event of failure of the primary operator. The language was brief, almost buried. A compliance relic, presented as an estate safety disclosure, rather than a living system. What is the primary operator? I asked. Hargreaves aligned the binder with the edge of his desk. A historical term, he said. The engineering architecture of older Venus estates contains many such terms. That wasn't an answer. It was not intended as a medical answer. Dr. Fenton is better suited to that portion of the orientation. I left Hargreaves in the library and went looking for Edmund. I found Dr. Julian Fenton instead. He intercepted me in a second-floor corridor. Fenton was in his early 60s, clean-shaven, with the careful grooming and faint chemical flush of a functioning alcoholic. He wore a medical coat over civilian clothes, and his hands were immaculate in a way that suggested compulsive washing. Mr. Aldgate, Jules Fenton. I'm the household physician. Edmund asked me to give you the tour. You'll want to understand the medical infrastructure before you're formally part of the family. He showed me the upper medical suite on the 3rd floor. The room was clean, well lit by overhead panels, and equipped with surgical instruments I couldn't entirely identify. Standard operating tables, anesthesia systems, monitoring equipment. Alongside them, tools designed for work I'd never seen performed. Articulated clamps shaped to hold soft tissue against rigid housings, bone saws with micrometer depth settings calibrated for cuts close to neural pathways, and a rack of gold-plated connectors sized to interface organic tissue with clockwork gearing. On the far wall, half hidden behind a mobile bank of sterilization equipment, was a locked control panel marked with the Palliser crest. Beneath the crest, engraved into brass dulled by years of cleaning, were the words, Reserve Atmospheric Governance, Manual Authority. Fenton noticed me reading it and looked away too quickly. Edmund's upkeep is a full-time occupation, he said. He picked up one of the gold connectors and turned it between his fingers with absent fondness. 40% of his body is engineered replacement now. Heart, lungs, most of the digestive system, both legs below the knee, the left arm from the shoulder, all clockwork and fluid circuit. Beautiful work, if I say so. The challenge is the interface, keeping tissue bonded to golden housing without rejection, infection, or signal degradation. The neural junction, I said. The term had surfaced in the contract's technical appendices, undefined but referenced 3 times. Fenton set the connector down. His expression tightened around the eyes. The junction is Mr. Palliser's central modification. It connects his brain, his remaining original brain tissue, to the mansion's operating systems: atmospheric regulation, balloon pressure, power distribution, atmospheric sealing. Edmund runs it. His nervous system is the estate's primary control architecture. Fenton paused. Colonial-era work, adapted over decades. There's nothing else like it in the cloud settlements. What happens if it fails? His hand closed around the connector until his knuckles whitened. "It doesn't fail," he said, and then, after a moment, "At least not in any way the household has survived long enough to document." He moved the conversation to routine medical matters after that. My health records, the estate's pharmacy, atmospheric exposure protocols. He spoke well. He also kept glancing at the locked control panel as though it had begun to breathe. I let him talk. I was calculating distances, the landing bay, the medical suite, the reserve governance panel, the corridors between them. After Fenton left, I went to the landing bay. The vault-grade door was sealed. I tried the access panel. It required a code I didn't have. Through the small observation window set into the door's upper frame, I could see the bay interior, empty. The cargo pallet where my bags had been unloaded was bare. The chemical wash stations were dry. The pilot had been gone for hours. I found Hargreaves in the corridor outside the library and asked when the return transport would be available. "Atmospheric conditions have worsened since yesterday," he said, consulting a schedule on his personal terminal. "Transit services into the lower cloud layer are suspended. I've submitted a request for the next available departure window. Current estimate is 3 to 5 days. The pilot yesterday seemed to manage the conditions. Descent and ascent conditions differ considerably. I'm sure you understand." Hargreaves returned to his terminal. "In the meantime, Mr. Palliser has asked me to inform you that dinner this evening will be a more formal occasion. The household observes certain traditions before a family integration. Your formal wardrobe should be sufficient." "I still haven't met his daughter." Hargreaves's face did not change. "The contract identifies the eligible party according to the requirements of Venus colonial law," he said. "Personal introductions are handled according to household sequence." He walked away. The ticking of his shoes on the corridor floor fell into the interval of the atmospheric system, which fell into the interval of the servants' masks, which fell into the interval of the golden gears I'd seen turning inside Edmund Palliser's open chest. That afternoon, while the household prepared for the evening's formal dinner, I went below. I'd been watching the servants' traffic patterns since morning. They moved through the upper floors on predictable routes. Corridor to kitchen, kitchen to dining hall to Edmund's private wing. But twice I'd seen masked figures emerge from a service stairwell near the mansion's central axis and descend carrying sealed containers. The containers were heavy enough to require 2 hands and left condensation trails on the corridor floor. Whatever was inside them was colder than the surrounding air and wet. The service stairwell dropped 3 levels beneath the main floors. The architecture changed with each landing. First floor below, stone walls gave way to riveted metal panels, the corridor narrowing to a maintenance tunnel with overhead pipe runs and emergency lighting. Second floor, the tunnel opened into a pressurized transition chamber with chemical wash stations and a rack of heavy-duty environment suits, sized for the servants' frames. Third floor, the chamber connected to an exterior catwalk, enclosed by a transparent tube of reinforced polymer that ran along the mansion's underbelly. Through the polymer walls, I could see the suspension structure beneath the estate, a web of girders, cable junctions, pipe runs, and mounting brackets connecting the mansion to its balloon array. Below the girders was open atmosphere. The cloud layer sat maybe 200 meters down, yellow-brown and heavy, drifting in bands that caught the distant sunlight and turned it to a sour glow. Wind buffeted the tube. The polymer flexed. I kept walking. The catwalk terminated at a pressurized hatch marked with the Palliser family crest and a maintenance code I couldn't decipher. The hatch was unlocked. Either the servants who used this route expected no one else down here, or what lay beyond had never been meant to leave. I opened it and went through. The chamber was the size of the dining hall above, but vertical. It hung beneath the mansion's belly like a cathedral inverted, its walls curved and riveted, its floor a metal grating through which I could see open cloud far below. The space was cold. Condensation beaded on every surface. Overhead lights mounted on the chamber's ceiling, which was the mansion's underside, cast a flat, shadowless wash over everything inside. 5 cylindrical tanks hung from the ceiling on heavy chains, each one roughly 2 meters tall and a meter across, made of transparent polymer braced with steel bands. The tanks were filled with amber preservation fluid. Tubes ran from each tank upward through the ceiling into the mansion's infrastructure. Dozens per tank, color-coded, some carrying fluid down into the cylinders and others drawing fluid out. Each tank contained a man. The first body I approached had been in the fluid long enough for the preservation chemistry to bleach his skin to the color of wet paper. He was suspended vertically, arms floating at his sides, tubes entering his wrists, neck, abdomen, and the base of his skull. His eyes were closed. Sections of his torso had been opened and resealed. I could see the scars where tissue had been excised and closed with medical adhesive. His left side was missing a kidney-shaped section of flesh below the ribs. His right thigh had a rectangular patch where skin and muscle had been removed down to the bone and dressed with synthetic covering. His chest rose and fell in time with the atmospheric system above. He was breathing with the house. The second body had been stripped further. Both forearms had been cleared of skin from wrist to elbow, the exposed underlayers sealed with polymer coating. His abdomen showed 3 harvest sites where organs had been removed and the cavities packed with a dense gel that held their shape. His head was shaved and bore a line of surgical staples running from his forehead over the crown of his skull to the base of his neck. His eyes were open. They didn't track. Whatever had been behind them had stopped processing years ago. The third and fourth tanks held bodies in more advanced states of harvesting. Less tissue remained, more synthetic fill, more tubes. These men had been here long enough that their original forms were difficult to identify beneath the accumulation of surgical intervention. They were alive. The fluid cycled, the chemical feeds ran, the monitoring indicators on their tank housings glowed green. But they had been reduced to biological infrastructure. Tissue farms, their organs, skin, marrow, and cellular material were being drawn out through the tubes and fed upward into the mansion's systems, where they sustained Edmund Palace's remaining biological components and whatever else required human material to operate. The fifth tank held Malcolm Dwyer. I knew his name because it was printed on a medical tag affixed to the tank's lower mounting bracket, alongside a date of arrival 18 months prior and a procurement code that matched the format in the marriage contract's jurisdictional supplements. Dwyer was younger than the others, or at least less damaged. His body showed early-stage harvesting, a single site on his left flank where tissue had been removed, and a series of small puncture scars on his arms where marrow had been extracted. His face was intact. His eyes were open. His eyes tracked me. I stepped closer. Dwyer's mouth moved behind the preservation fluid. The words were soundless, but I could make out some of them through the polymer. He was repeating something. I pressed my hand against the tank's surface. Dwyer pressed his from the inside. His fingers were pale and waterlogged, but they moved with intention. He tapped against the polymer, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, then he mouthed a word. Run, then more, slower. I watched his lips and reconstructed the words one at a time. Body, failing, needs, yours. Dwyer's eyes held mine. He was conscious, alert and terrified beyond the panic of a trapped body. This was the terror of a man who understood exactly where he was, what had been done to him, and what was about to happen to someone standing on the other side of the glass. He'd had 18 months to understand it. My hand slipped down the tank. For one stupid second, I thought of my mother's signature on the preliminary agreement, her hand trembling from exhaustion and hope. I thought of the settlement schedule, the restored water claim registration, the neat columns of numbers that had made my body look like a solution. Dwyer tapped the polymer one more time and mouthed a final phrase. Others didn't fit. The previous suitors. The 4 ruined bodies in their tanks. They had been brought here under the same contract, The same promises, the same 22-page gap between what they'd signed on Mars or Earth and what they found on Venus. Tested for compatibility, found unsuitable, repurposed, and Dwyer, kept intact, preserved as backup, his medical tag updated monthly while he floated and watched through the amber fluid. A sound behind me. A masked servant stood in the hatchway, hands at his sides. The filters in his mask ticked. The same interval as everything else in the estate. The same interval as the old man's golden chest. He watched without trying to restrain me or summon help. After a moment, he stepped aside with a small, formal inclination of his head, as if his task had been only to confirm that I had seen what the household wanted seen. I walked past him, through the hatch, back along the polymer-enclosed catwalk, up through the maintenance levels and into the upper corridors, where another servant was polishing the banister and arranging cut crystal on a sideboard for the evening's formal dinner. I returned to my quarters and locked the door. The formal dinner began at 7. I attended because refusing would have invited immediate restraint, and because Edmund no longer needed to wonder what I knew. If the servant below had been a witness, then my ignorance was over by household design. I needed Edmund comfortable, unhurried, still treating me as a man doing arithmetic on his own future, still believing the contract was under consideration. The dining hall had been set for ceremony. Silver, crystal, fresh linens on the long table. Heavy drapes embroidered with the Palliser crest covered the acid-scarred windows for the first time, as though the occasion required hiding the view. Edmund sat at the head of the table, in a fresh robe, darker gold than the previous ones, buttoned high enough to conceal whatever was happening beneath it. Hargreaves occupied the chair to his right, contract binder squared before him like a prayer book. Dr. Fenton sat across from me, already working through his first glass of wine. 6 masked servants lined the walls, their filter cartridges clicking in the house's tempo. In 2 days at the estate, the daughter had remained an abstraction. Her name had never been spoken. Her portrait had never appeared among the Palliser ancestors. Edmund's promise of sequence and Hargreaves's legal phrasing were the closest I had come to an introduction. The marriage contract referred to her as the eligible party and the Palliser designee, but she occupied no visible place in the household's operation. Whether she existed in any meaningful sense or was a legal fiction constructed to make the contract enforceable had become impossible to answer and irrelevant to survival. Edmund watched me take my seat. "I understand you visited the lower preservation chamber," he said. Fenton's knife paused against the edge of his plate. Hargreaves kept his eyes on the binder. "I got lost," I said. "Naturally. Old houses make their own maps." Edmund folded his hands on the table. "I regret that the chamber is distressing. Most serious families conceal the material basis of continuity behind cleaner language. We have found candor more humane in the long run." "Humane?" "Yes," Edmund said without irony. "A man ought to understand the household he joins." Hargreaves stood to introduce the meal. He spoke with rehearsed formality, his voice tuned to the register of institutional tradition, half liturgy, half legal disclosure. The Palliser household observes the custom of inheritance dining before each formal integration. Each course has been prepared from tissue cultured in the estate's medical fabrication suite from Mr. Palliser's own biological reserves. The tradition affirms the continuity of the family's biological estate and the shared obligation of all household members to preserve the Palliser line. He sat. The first course arrived. It was presented beautifully. A small portion on white porcelain, garnished with cultivated herbs, drizzled with a reduction sauce. It looked like a fine appetizer from an expensive restaurant. The medical tag beside the plate, printed in small formal script on a card bordered with the family crest, identified the source material: hepatic tissue, original Palliser biological stock, cultured from preserved samples of Edmund's original liver, harvested before its clockwork replacement 31 years ago. I was being asked to eat a piece of Edmund Palliser's liver. I looked at Edmund. He was already eating, cutting his own tissue with unhurried movements, chewing with visible satisfaction. Hargreaves ate the way he did everything else, methodically, without commentary. Fenton kept his eyes on his plate. When his fork touched the first course, his hand trembled once before he steadied it with wine. The servants ate through ports in their masks, small hinged openings below the filter cartridges, sized for a spoon or fork. They ate standing, in synchronized motions, chewing while their masks clicked. I picked up my fork. The texture was dense, finely grained, closer to pâté than fresh meat. The sauce masked most of the underlying character, but something mineral lingered under the sweetness, rich and intimate and wrong. I chewed and swallowed and reached for my water glass. I took the next bite because stopping meant questions I couldn't afford to answer. The second course was cardiac tissue. The third was a consommé made from cultured bone marrow. The fourth, a heavier dish, almost a stew, contained what the medical tag identified as pulmonary samples from lungs Edmund had replaced 19 years ago. Each card traced its course through decades of Edmund's self-replacement. The meal was a biography told in discarded parts, a catalogue of everything golden clockwork had made expendable. During the third course, Edmund's left hand locked. The fingers froze mid-cut, the fork suspended over his plate, and I heard the gears in his forearm grinding against resistance they were never meant to encounter. Metal teeth skipped, caught, failed to re-engage. Fenton set down his glass and watched. After 4 or 5 seconds, the hand released and resumed cutting. Edmund continued eating as though nothing had changed, but his movements had slipped out of alignment with the clicking of the servants' masks. For the first time since I'd arrived, the house's rhythm was uneven. Fenton excused himself before dessert. I followed 3 minutes later and found him in the service corridor outside the kitchen, leaning against the wall with a glass in his hand. The professional composure from the medical suite had worn through. He looked tired in a way that suggested months of accumulated exhaustion, the kind alcohol manages without curing. His hand locked at the table, I said. I saw. How long does he have? Fenton took a drink. Depends on what you mean. The clockwork keeps the body moving indefinitely, self-winding, self-lubricating, beautifully engineered. The problem is the junction. The signal pathway between the implant and the clockwork body is degrading, has been for over a decade. The more the connection deteriorates, the less precise the junction's control becomes. Tonight was a signal propagation failure. The brain sent the command. The junction corrupted it. The gears received garbage and seized. And when the connection fails entirely? Fenton looked at me with the appraising expression. The junction goes dead. The mansion's primary control architecture loses its operator. Balloon pressure regulation, atmospheric sealing, power distribution. Everything runs through Edmund's nervous system. When that stops, the backup generators can hold atmosphere for maybe 6 hours. After that, the seals fail, the balloons lose calibration, and the structure begins descending. Everyone inside, servants, staff, the men in the vats, goes with it. Atmospheric pressure hits crush depth about 40 minutes after seal failure. There's a backup control system, I said. His glass stopped moving. Manual atmospheric governance, I continued. The contract references it. The panel is in your surgical suite. Hargreaves called the primary operator a historical term because he didn't want to say Edmund's brain. The house can run on independent backup if the junction is disconnected. The hardware is wired into the same systems the junction controls, and it's been sitting dormant while the junction eats his brain. Fenton set his glass on the floor. His expression had shifted from exhaustion to something more alert and considerably more frightened. The backup runs through a separate circuit, he said, hardwired into the same systems. I test the panel once a year under no load because the maintenance protocol still requires a signature. But activating it requires disconnection of the primary junction first, at the source, Edmund's brain stem. You can't run both simultaneously. The signals conflict. And if someone disconnected the junction, you'd need Edmund's skull open to reach the hardware. Fenton looked toward the dining hall doors, which happens to be exactly the surgical condition that exists during a full cranial transplant. 2 hours after the household settled into its overnight cycle, I took an environment suit from the maintenance locker near the service stairwell. The suit was built for the servants' frames, shorter and broader across the shoulders than mine, and the seals at the wrists and ankles wouldn't close properly over my limbs. I adjusted what I could and left the rest gapping. The air supply was rated for 40 minutes, and its chemical-resistant outer layer was rated for conditions I hoped were worse than what I'd encounter outside. The regulation tower, the cylindrical structure mounted between two of the balloon cables, housed the estate's atmospheric monitoring equipment and external communications array. My terminal had no direct outbound reach. The landing bay was sealed. The house exchange required local authority. If the array worked, I could send a distress signal to the transit authority at the Venus orbital station. A standard emergency pickup took 4 to 6 hours in favorable conditions. I needed the conditions to be favorable. I chose the exterior route because I trusted it more than the interior one. The mansion's corridors were full of masked servants whose movements tracked Edmund's awareness. The maintenance bridge was exposed to the atmosphere but should have been empty at night. The bridge access was through a pressurized airlock on the south wing's lowest occupied floor. The airlock was unlocked. I cycled through and stepped outside. Venus hit me immediately. The wind was a physical weight, saturated with moisture that burned where it touched exposed skin. The suit's poor fit at the wrists gave the atmosphere access almost at once. The bridge was a corroded metal gantry, maybe 90 meters long, with low railings and a walkway of perforated plating. Visibility was 5 or 6 meters. Beyond that, the yellow-brown haze swallowed everything. Below the grating, the cloud layer shifted and churned. The acid condensation began working on the suit's outer layer within the first 20 meters. I tracked its progress by touch, the chemical-resistant coating softening, turning tacky, thinning until I could feel the wind's heat through the fabric. The burns started as numbness on my left forearm where the wrist seal had gapped. Then came a spreading warmth that sharpened into a focused pain, like pressing a hand to a hot pan and being unable to pull away. The condensation was dissolving the suit and everything beneath it at roughly the same rate. 40 meters from the tower, I heard the clicking behind me. 3 masked servants emerged from the haze. They wore full coverage suits rated for extended acid exposure, sealed properly at every joint. Each carried instruments from the medical suite, articulated surgical clamps, tissue-cutting shears, the specialized tools designed for separating biological material from clockwork housing. They carried them openly, professionally, the way orderlies carry equipment to an operating table. They were retrieving estate property. I ran. The bridge swayed under my weight. The wind caught me sideways, and the suit's left sleeve dissolved entirely, exposing my forearm to the open atmosphere. The pain widened and deepened, like the arm had been peeled and pressed against heated stone. Condensation gathered in the raw surface and burned through. I could feel layers separating, outer skin, then the tissue beneath, then a slick, bright agony that meant the acid had reached muscle. The tower was close. I could see its dark cylinder through the haze, the communications array mounted on its upper face, the access hatch at bridge level. I reached the hatch. It required a key card I didn't have. The servants closed the distance while I stood at the locked hatch with acid eating my arm. The tallest one placed a surgical clamp on my right wrist, gently, precisely, the way you'd handle a sample you intended to preserve intact, and the other 2 took positions at my shoulders. They turned me around and walked me back across the bridge, into the airlock, through the pressurization cycle, and into the south wing corridor. Edmund was waiting in the conservatory. He sat in his assisted chair beneath the dead, embalmed oak saplings, and his nearly bronze robe, buttoned high, failed to muffle the sounds his chest was making. Gears struggled. Fluid surged through tubing with an irregular cadence. The atmospheric system's rhythm was losing coherence as the junction's signal degraded. "I understand the impulse," Edmund said. He looked at my left arm, stripped from wrist to elbow in a chemical burn that was already blistering in the mansion's treated atmosphere. "And I'm sorry about the arm. Fenton will dress that tonight." The tower was locked. "The tower has been ceremonial for some time. The second candidate mistook it for a point of exit too. We corrected the vulnerability afterward." "You disconnected the array." "I removed a false hope," Edmund said. "False hopes make men injure themselves." He leaned forward. The chair's gears ground with the effort, louder than they'd been the day before. "The transplant will take place tomorrow morning. I've asked Fenton to prepare the surgical suite by 8. You'll be sedated, and the procedure itself takes approximately 6 hours. Your body will survive intact. That's the entire point. My brain will replace yours in your skull, and the junction hardware will be transferred with it. You'll be gone, but everything else about you will continue. I want you to understand that this is preservation. Your tissue, your blood, your unmodified biology, it carries on. That's more than most men get." He settled back in the chair. "Please don't attempt the bridge again. The next suit failure will cost you more than an arm, and I need the body complete." Fenton came to my quarters an hour after the servants locked the door, carrying a medical kit and a bottle of something amber that served double duty as wound wash and personal anesthetic depending on whether he poured it on the arm or down his throat. He did both. The burn ran from wrist to elbow. Fenton cleaned it, applied a chemical neutralizer that stung worse than the original acid, and wrapped it in synthetic skin that bonded to the exposed tissue with a spreading adhesive warmth. He worked with steady, habitual competence, a man who had treated acid injuries too many times to be careful about them. "You tried the tower," he said. "The communications array. The array has been dead for 6 years. Edmund had it disconnected when the second suitor tried what you just tried." Fenton secured the last strip of synthetic skin and sat back. "You burned yourself reaching a machine that doesn't function. I let that settle. Tomorrow morning," I said. 8 o'clock, he told me. "I know, I'm performing it." "You've done this before." "Attempted it twice. Both times the recipient body rejected the junction hardware within hours. The brain survived the transfer. Edmund's brain is remarkably resilient. But the junction wouldn't integrate with the new neural tissue. The bodies went into the vats." Fenton capped the neutralizer. "You're the best candidate I've seen. Young, unmodified, strong immune system. The junction might take." "And if it does? If the transplant succeeds?" "The junction burns through whatever body it runs through. His body, my body. The same interface, the same tissue damage, the same failure. A few years of function, then another body. Where does the next one come from?" Fenton was quiet. The atmospheric system ticked through the walls, its interval grown ragged. The junction degrading faster, the mansion's rhythm fraying with it. "You'll still be here," I said. "You can't leave either. Another cycle, another transplant, another suitor you have to carve up when the body fails, getting older and drunker and more involved in something you stopped pretending was medicine years ago." Fenton looked down at his hands. They were clean. "The third one was awake when we moved him to the tank," he said. "Not fully. Enough to know he wasn't dead. Enough to try to speak. I told myself the preservation fluid would quiet the cortex." "Did it?" "You saw Dwyer." I said nothing. Fenton took a long drink from the bottle. Then he set it on the floor between his shoes and looked at the wall behind my head. "What are you asking me to do?" "Your job. Tomorrow morning, when you open his skull, I need to be conscious. Delay the anesthesia. Tell him the burns complicated my sedation protocol. Tell him my blood chemistry needs stabilization. Whatever makes medical sense. Open his skull, expose the junction, and give me 30 seconds. To do what? Disconnect the junction and activate the backup. If you disconnect the junction, Edmund dies. His brain has no independent life support." "I know." Fenton picked up the bottle again. The atmospheric system stuttered through another uneven cycle. "The backup," he said. "You're banking on hardware that's never been tested under operational load. The circuit is sound. I've checked it annually. It's part of the maintenance protocol. But switching from a neural junction to an automated system while the house is suspended in Venus's atmosphere creates a gap. The systems have to recognize the primary signal is gone before they'll accept the secondary. That gap could be 30 seconds, could be 2 minutes. 2 minutes without pressure regulation. 2 minutes without anything. Balloons, seals, atmosphere, power. Everything Edmund's brain controls goes dead until the backup catches." I looked at the synthetic skin on my arm. The burn beneath it sent a deep, steady ache up through my shoulder. 2 minutes, I said. Against a lifetime of transplants, each one eating through another brain, each one needing another body. You've already put 5 men in those vats. How many more before the junction kills every brain you feed it and there's nobody left to operate the house at all? Fenton drank, set the bottle down, stood up. 8 o'clock, he said. "I'll handle the sedation schedule." He left. The door locked behind him. Through the walls, the mansion's rhythm continued. Uneven, searching, the gears and pumps and filters trying to hold a pattern that their operator's dying brain could no longer maintain. I sat on the bed and waited for morning. The surgical suite was bright and cold. Fenton had prepared 2 operating tables side by side, with separate instrument trays, monitoring equipment, and anesthesia rigs arranged between them. The reserve control terminal stood exposed on the far wall now, its brass cover unlocked and folded open beneath a bank of status displays. Edmund arrived in a wheelchair, assisted by 2 servants who locked the chair beside his table and helped him onto the surface. Without the gold-stitched robe, his body's construction was visible for the first time. His torso was a patchwork of golden clockwork housings, translucent fluid lines, and surviving strips of original tissue held in place by gold-plated surgical brackets. His legs below the knees were pure clockwork, golden gearing and articulated joints, beautifully machined, ticking with each involuntary shift. His left arm was the same from the shoulder down. Only his right arm, his neck and his head retained full biological appearance, and even there the waxy skin was being sustained well past its natural term. Fenton sedated Edmund first. The old man went under with the ease of someone who had been sedated for maintenance procedures hundreds of times. His eyes closed. His breathing continued, clock-driven, the golden gears in his chest keeping the rhythm the entire house followed. The servants stepped back to the walls. With Edmund unconscious, their movements changed by a fraction, less anticipatory, more dependent. They watched Fenton now, waiting for procedural instruction from the only conscious authority the surgical suite recognized. Fenton marked Edmund's skull with a surgical pen, tracing the incision line along the temple and around the back of the cranium. Then he turned to me. "Get on the table." I climbed onto the second table. Fenton attached monitoring pads to my chest and temples, made a show of calibrating the anesthesia rig, and drew a surgical line across my forehead with the same pen. His hands moved with steady, professional certainty. If Edmund had been awake, everything would have looked correct. "Candidate sedation delayed," Fenton said, loud enough for the servants to register. "Chemical burns have compromised peripheral uptake, beginning cranial access on primary patient while stabilizing secondary patient." The servants accepted the language. Their masks ticked in rhythm with Edmund's artificial respiration. Fenton picked up the bone saw. The sound of the saw cutting through Edmund Palliser's skull was a high, thin whine that set my teeth together and travelled through the operating table's frame into my spine. Fenton cut with precision, following his marked line, adjusting depth continuously, monitoring the saw's micrometer settings to keep the blade clear of brain tissue. Bone dust drifted. The inner surface of the skull was wet and pale. Fenton lifted the section free and set it in a prepared tray. Edmund's brain lay exposed, grey folded, glistening under the surgical lights, laced with blood vessels that swelled and contracted in time with his clockwork circulation. At the base, where the brain connected to the upper spinal column, the neural junction was visible, a gold and ceramic interface the size of a man's thumb, bonded directly to the brainstem with filaments so fine they vanished into the neural tissue. From the junction, a bundle of sheathed cables ran downward through a port in Edmund's cervical vertebrae and into his body, connecting to the mansion's control systems through the same network of conduit and sealed piping that threaded every wall, corridor, and structural member of the estate. The junction was the house's brainstem. Everything above it was Edmund. Everything below it was the mansion. "Now," Fenton said quietly. I sat up, pulled the monitoring pads from my chest, and stepped off the table. The servants along the wall shifted, masks tilting toward me, the clicking accelerating, but Fenton raised a hand. "Hold position," he said. "Secondary patient requires repositioning. Burns have complicated sedation uptake." They paused. The command was medical, procedural, and Edmund's own signal was muted under anesthesia. Their hesitation bought seconds, not safety. I crossed to Edmund's table. Fenton handed me a pair of surgical grips, blunt-nosed clamps designed for connector work, and pointed to the junction. The primary cable bundle, the gold coupling at the base. Turn it counterclockwise 90 degrees and pull straight out. The junction will disengage from the brainstem. Do it clean. If you tear the filaments instead of releasing them, the feedback surge will be worse. The servants began moving again. I placed the grips on the gold coupling at the base of the neural junction. The metal was warm from Edmund's body heat and wet with cerebrospinal fluid. I turned it counterclockwise. 90 degrees. I felt a series of small, precise disengagements, filaments releasing from neural tissue one by one, like tiny hooks pulling free from fabric. Then the coupling came loose in the grips, and I pulled the junction out of Edmund Palliser's brain. Everything happened at once. Edmund's body fired. Every clockwork component in his torso, his legs, his arm activated simultaneously, gears spinning to maximum speed, fluid pumps surging, the golden housing in his chest slamming open as the magnetic clasps released without signal regulation. The maintenance cavity erupted outward. Dark biological fluid sprayed across the surgical table, the instrument trays, my arms. Tubing whipped free of its housings and lashed the air. The gears in his legs drove his knees upward hard enough to buckle the table's restraints, and his right arm, his one remaining biological arm, reached for me. His eyes opened. The sedation should have held, but the junction's disconnection had driven a massive neurological surge through his brain, and he was awake. Aware. His mouth opened and worked without sound. His vocal apparatus, part of the clockwork system, ground without coordination. Components in his throat caught and released against each other in a wet, percussive clicking that sounded like the servants' masks played at triple speed. His hand found my burned forearm and gripped. His fingers dug through the synthetic skin, dressing into the raw tissue beneath. The pain blanked my vision for a full second. I wrenched free, leaving strips of dressing in his fingers. Fenton was at the control terminal on the far wall, throwing switches in sequence. The mansion shuddered. The lights died. The atmospheric system stopped. For the first time since I'd arrived, the house fell silent. A deep, structural silence. The absence of every system that had been maintaining pressure, temperature, atmosphere, and buoyancy since Edmund's brain had first been wired into the walls. The servants froze. Their masks went still. Without the house's rhythm, they seemed briefly emptied of instruction. Then the floor tilted. A slow, sickening lean to port. I grabbed the edge of Edmund's operating table to stay upright. Through the surgical suite's window, the cloud layer was rising, or the mansion was descending toward it, the distinction meaningless at this altitude. The suspension balloons were venting gas at uncontrolled rates, and the estate was beginning its fall toward Venus's crushed depth. Edmund's hand was still reaching. His clockwork body was destroying itself on the table. Gears stripping their teeth, fluid lines bursting at the couplings, the golden housing cracking along its seams as every component ran without governance or limit. His eyes stayed open and tracked me through the dying light. The last expression I could identify on his face before the backup system engaged and the overhead panels surged back to operational brightness was recognition. He knew what I'd done. He understood what it cost. Fenton threw the final switch. The backup caught. The transition was rough, lights flaring, then dimming to working levels, the atmospheric system restarting with a stutter and a grinding hiss before settling into a new cycle. The floor's tilt slowed, stopped, and gradually corrected as the balloons repressurized under automated control. The mansion groaned around us, cable tension readjusting, structural members shifting loads they hadn't carried in decades, but it held. The house stayed in the sky. Edmund Palliser died on the surgical table. His brain, severed from the junction that had sustained it, shut down within minutes. His clockwork body continued moving longer than that, gears cycling through their stored energy, fluid draining from ruptured tubing, the golden components in his chest performing diminishing arcs until the last gear stopped and the last tube emptied, and the maintenance cavity hung open and dark and still. The servants stood motionless along the wall. Their masks had stopped clicking when the primary system died. Now, as the backup's atmospheric regulation came online, the filter cartridges began cycling again, unevenly, searching, catching at fragments of rhythm and losing them. The servants swayed on their feet, listening for a signal they had followed their entire working lives. Fenton sat on the floor beside the control panel, breathing hard. The bottle from the night before was in his coat pocket. He took it out and drank. "The backup is holding," he said, "but it's designed for short-term emergency operation. The automated systems can maintain balloon pressure and atmospheric sealing for maybe 72 hours without human oversight. After that, the calibration drifts, pressure differentials build, seal integrity degrades. Someone has to sit at that terminal and manage the corrections by hand." "For how long?" "Until someone builds a better system or evacuates the estate. The servants can't be evacuated without custom life support. Their lungs have been adapted to the mansion's specific atmospheric mix over years of mask dependency. Standard transit atmosphere would destroy their respiratory tissue within an hour. The men in the vats need the fluid circulation infrastructure built into the mansion's hull, and there's no transit service until the atmospheric window reopens, which, even if Hargreaves actually submitted a request, is days away at best." I looked at the control terminal on the wall. Its displays showed balloon pressure across 3 arrays, atmospheric composition in 12 zones, power distribution, seal integrity, thermal regulation. Every reading was within tolerance. Every one of them was drifting slowly towards the margins. "Someone has to stay and run the house," I said. Fenton did not answer. I sat down at the terminal. The chair was Edmund's. I recognized it by the brass controls built into the armrests, the assisted movement gearing, the shape of the seat worn by decades of the same body. The displays responded to manual input. I adjusted the balloon pressure in Array 2, which had dropped a full point since the backup engaged. I corrected a thermal imbalance in the east wing. I opened a ventilation relay that had closed during the transition and was restricting airflow to the lower maintenance levels. Through the acid-scarred window, the cloud layer stretched to the horizon, yellow-brown, permanent. Edmund's body lay on the operating table behind me. Fenton was wrapping it in surgical sheeting. The clockwork had stopped. The gold had gone dull. Along the wall, the servants' masks were still cycling in their broken, searching pattern, clicking, pausing, stuttering. I adjusted the atmospheric system's output cycle on the terminal, standardizing the ventilation intervals across all 12 zones to a steady, even tempo. The change propagated through the mansion's ductwork, its filters and the cartridges socketed into the servants' masks. The clicking steadied, slowed, found the new interval and locked onto it. 6 masks cycling in unison, synchronized to the tempo I had set. The tempo matched my breathing. I corrected a pressure reading in Array 3 and settled deeper into the chair.